This is the chicken loop release on the Zeeko Ultimate Bar. It's a beautifully designed part and it normally works very well, but it has a problem in that it will release unexpectedly for no reason. The interior mechanism is very clever. There is a jaw, a pair of jaws, with one tooth at the top that can move and two fixed teeth at the bottom. When the loop at the end of the chicken loop goes in, the top tooth is closed over it by the orange housing that slides down over and holds it in place. Now the chicken loop cannot release ever unless those jaws open. And in theory, that's not supposed to happen if this is closed unless a person pushes on this by hand to open it. It should not open at any other time. However, it does. So there are only two things that can cause this to open by itself. These tongs at the top are hooking on a ridge in the black part inside and prevent this from being pushed away under light load or just a bump unless a human pushes it away, and then it opens the jaws. Well, these tongs may not have enough pressure when they're being held closed by the elasticity of the material. The ridge inside may not be big enough. The hook on the tong may not be big enough. I don't know, but I cannot see inside there. However, I tried to solve that problem by adding this bungee, which I started there, drilled a hole, brought out here, drilled a hole, put it there, and this bungee adds considerable more tension to open this. It's still no issue when a human hand does it, but presumably it would prevent an accidental bump doing it. However, the chicken loop has still been releasing unexpectedly. So the other reason why the jaws might open is that if you look inside there, which is not easy to see, I don't think, the tooth that moves up and down is held in place by a metal pin. There are two, one here and one here. The distance between these pins is such that when the housing is slipped over the base, the pins keep the jaws closed. However, this case is quite flexible, amazingly so. Look at this. That's very flexible. I would have thought that they would have used a material much more rigid than that, or made the wall thickness much thicker so that there would not be any flex. The pin that's inside there is also relatively thin. It's the size of a bicycle spoke, and I suppose this one tooth that's pressing against the pin could bend it ever so slightly. The plastic could flex ever so slightly, just enough for this jaw to open, just enough for this to slip out. It's hard to imagine that it can do that, but that is what's happening. The case is either sliding away, allowing the jaw to open, or the case is flexing, the pins are parting just enough to allow the jaw to open. If you look in there, depending how well this can work, there's a lot of play. I can take this knife and slide it between the pin and the tooth that it's holding in place and move it around quite a bit. There's a gap almost as thick as the wire itself, the pin itself. There's a gap between it and the pin. So if the orange housing flexes, the pin maybe bends ever so slightly, just enough that that can open without the cover being pushed away, then we have a problem. Whatever we need to do is make it so that this orange housing cannot allow the jaws to open. Well, I've done the bungee thing to prevent it being slid that way, and on one occasion when it opened, I suspected that the housing had not slipped away, and yet it was open. So I'm convinced that the flexibility of this material and the size, the diameter of those pins, the positioning of those pins, allows too much play between that movable tooth and the housing that's supposed to keep it closed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this material, piece of stainless, and I'm going to cut a pin out of it, remove this pin, and insert this pin, and see how much of the play is taken away. If just replacing one pin makes the whole assembly tight enough that it's impossible for those jaws to open, then I will have solved the problem. If it still can happen, then I will replace the other pin with some more of this metal. However, of course, I cannot overdo it because the orange housing has to slide over the teeth in order to close those jaws. So the happy medium, of course, is that the distance between these two pins must be such that under no circumstances will that distance increase due to flexing and allow the jaws to open. Once I've solved that problem, then I would say that this is just a wonderful piece. I think at the factory, if they'd simply made this much thicker, not necessarily everywhere, but this area, if this had been 2 or 3 times the wall thickness with zero flexibility, and the pins had been positioned with less play, then the problem would have been non-existent. Alternatively, the material that this is made of may be too soft a plastic. I don't know why anybody would design anything that can flex like that. It just doesn't make sense. Now, this black housing, when the orange housing is over it, is designed to prevent the flexing, but it's obviously not within the tolerances to do so. There is still enough play. Look how this moves, for example. There is still enough play in this whole situation that it can open without the housing necessarily sliding away. So I will make this new pin, install it, test it, and give a report back.